So I don't know, let me see if I can see who we got on here. One sec, participants, attendees. Perfect. Well, welcome everyone. My name is Jens Burley. I am a plastic reconstructive surgeon out in Oregon, in Portland. And I'm originally from Switzerland. So, when ACAPS was doing the initiatives, for the medical students for this year's application cycle, which is, as we all know, a bit more difficult due to COVID, the inability to travel, and that affects, both the kind of national residents, but also international residents who can't come for observerships or, visiting the U.S. and connecting, with other peers and mentors. And so ACAPS has done quite a bit of an effort within the US, and we wanted to also extend, some of that information to the international medical graduates. We'd love to hear, from you where you're from. And then afterwards, each of us, we're all international medical graduates, will tell you briefly kind of about our story, some of the obstacles we faced, and then the majority of the hour I really want to spend just on Q&A. I've tried to put a panel together with kind of different backgrounds and routes, getting into plastic surgery from the general surgery route and doing a plastic surgery fellowship, people going through the lab, people going through the prelim route. So hopefully we'll be able to answer, some of your questions. I see we currently have about 9 attendees. If you can just very quickly, just say your name and country, and that's it. Maybe we'll start with Amir. Or you know what, maybe even easier, why don't you just write it in the chat, then we can see it there. Otherwise everyone has to turn on and off the microphone. So maybe why don't I start? So as mentioned, I come from Switzerland. I did 2 years of general surgery in Switzerland before deciding that I was gonna do a general surgery prelim time in the United States. For me, the route to plastic surgery was, kind of unexpected. There was an opening as a third year at Johns Hopkins where I did my prelim years. So a lot of the applicants, when they ask me for my story, are usually a little bit jealous because it kind of just came to me rather than the other way around, which is very unusual. And then I did my plastic surgery time at Johns Hopkins and then moved out to Oregon as faculty, where I've been in the past 4 years. And, so, kind of the obstacles or the barriers when you move to the US, at least the way that I moved here, was very much an unknown. And so kind of keeping that open, open mind and usually hard work and also being kind and being available to people and just doing a good job usually opens doors, and it's not always predictable which doors it will open. For me, I had a different kind of career path that I thought I would do. So I think that was kind of my takeaway point. For others in this group, this may be very different. And also for some of you who are very determined that you want to do plastic surgery in the United States, that may be a more clear path. But I do think keeping an open mind is important, because otherwise you potentially may get disappointed because it's not always possible to do exactly what it is you think you will. So I'll pass it on to Lisa. Maybe you can briefly talk about your path to the plastic surgery residency and where you are now.
Yeah, no problem. So I think, for me, I knew I wanted to do plastic surgery pretty early on in medical school. And, if you're still in medical school, I really recommend you go and visit other countries for sub-Is, because it's so interesting to see different educational systems and get a feel for what it would be like to train in these countries. So I did that when I was a medical student. I went to Mount Sinai in New York, and I rotated there. And, I really thought it was amazing and decided, I want to go and train in the United States. There's a lot of advantages of training here, some disadvantages too, of course. So how did I do that? It actually ended up being very important that I did a sub internship while I was in medical school, because once you graduate medical school, you're actually no longer allowed to do sub-Is in the United States. You're only allowed to do something called an observership, where you're not actually allowed to scrub, and it's really not very hands-on. So it's then hard for the people you rotate with to really give you good letters of recommendation. So one of the hurdles is for IMGs that once you graduate, you can't do a real sub-I anymore. So I really encourage you to do one while you're still in medical school, and keep in touch with these people because they can write you a clinical letter of recommendation. Then what I did is I applied for research, and I think research is really important for IMGs. I was able to combine that with a PhD degree, but you don't have to do that. I think it's way less important in the United States than, for example, in Europe to have a PhD. But, you know, I wasn't sure whether or not I would go back, so I thought it would be a good idea. And for me, it certainly, I feel like it is helping me a lot now with my research to have a degree. However, I think it's really great to do research because A, you'll get a feel for the country and you'll be able to make a decision of, you know, do I really want to train here? And B, you're going to meet a lot of people. You're going to go to conferences and present. And if you do a good job, people will, you know, get to know you. And I think that's a very important part when you're starting to apply and you send your application somewhere, that people actually recognize your name and have seen you at conferences. Yeah, and from research, I then applied to residency, and I matched at Harvard as an integrated plastic surgery resident. I'm currently in my 5th year, and I'm starting my chief year now. The other hurdle that I wanted to mention is, you know, visas. I was very fortunate to have a colleague who talked to me about this before I started residency, and I was able to apply for a green card before I started residency, which I think was important. And I think you really need to think about your visa status before you start residency, because there can be hurdles after training that you're required to go back, for example. And I think that's a difficult thing to face at the end of training.
Lisa, maybe we can talk about, there seems the visa is for everyone always a real big topic. So maybe we can kind of separately talk about all that and give each one of us tell how they, you know, that their kind of visa
Oh, sorry,
path.
I was like talking
That's
about
okay.
hurdles. Okay, I'm done.
Rana, do you want to get?
Sure. My name's Rana. I'm from the UK. I did medical school in the University of Edinburgh and worked for 2 years there as a house officer before moving to the US. The reason I moved to the US is basically because my whole family moved, so I didn't have a visa issue. I had a green card through parents. So after moving here, took some time to sort of do the USMLE exams and do kind of volunteering. As Lisa said, once you graduate medical school, you cannot get any kind of sub-Is. So I did actually encounter that problem. There was no way that you could get any kind of clinical experience. So when I applied, I actually applied to general surgery since I did not know that I was interested in plastics at that point. But when I applied, I had no US experience and I had no US letters of recommendation. So I was actually interns with Jens at Hopkins in their prelim program for 2 years before transferring to UCLA to finish general surgery. And then during my general surgery time at UCLA was when I actually became interested in plastics. I had some exposure there. And so I finished 3 years of plastics at UT in Memphis, and then just finished a 1-year micro fellowship in Seattle. In terms of difficulties, visa aside, I think the biggest one that I have found, well, the biggest two probably that I have found is US experience and US letters of recommendation. That was a big disadvantage for me when I was applying. I was in touch with other medical students from the UK and international students that had done like sub-Is, and they had letters to support them, and they got a lot more sort of interviews and opportunities than I did. And then the other one I would say is probably research. I agree with Lisa that research is very important. You really need to establish yourself as being outstanding in order to be able to sort of get the opportunities. And that also goes along the lines of USMLE scores. Because lots of applications can be basically not even read if they look at your scores and they're not at a certain cutoff that they've decided. That's it.
Thank you. George? You're muted. George, you have to unmute yourself.
Sorry. Thanks for having me tonight. My name is George Kokosis. I'm originally from Greece, born and raised in Athens. I went to med school in Athens, Greece. I decided I wanted to be a plastic surgeon while I was a medical student. But I kind of decided later on I wanted to come to the US for residency training. So I had already graduated in Greece, and then there's a couple of things that are mandatory in Greece for recent medical graduates. You have to join the armed forces, which I did for a year, as well as you have to go to a rural area and be basically a primary care physician for a year. So I did that. During those 2 years was the moment where I decided I want to go to the US for training. One of my closest friends was doing the same thing. So we kind of were study buddies and was easier to motivate each other. Unfortunately, I did not do a sub-I. So when I came here, the only thing I knew was that you have to do research and, you know, have some publications, have some networking. So I did 2 years of research in a plastic surgery lab that was at Duke University. And then I was given the opportunity to spend 1 year as a preliminary resident at the general surgery program. And sure enough, I got lucky. Someone dropped out that year. I was the right person, the right moment, the right place. They gave me the categorical spot. From that point on, things got a little bit easier. They knew early on that I wanted to do plastics. It was not an issue. And so my 2 years of research and networking in plastics kind of helped me moving forward to get back on track with being engaged in plastic surgery research and apply for eventually as a PGY4 in general surgery. I matched at Johns Hopkins. I did an independent program there for 3 years. And after that, and actually as of now, I am a microsurgery fellow at Memorial Sloan Kettering. And this is going to be the last step of 11 years of effort to become a plastic surgeon in the US and finally get a job. So for me, I regretted that I did not plan ahead while I was in medical school. I think as the other panelists said, I echo what they said about the significance and the importance of the sub-internship. This is the only time that you can have hands-on, can have real-time one-on-one with faculty and all that stuff. So very important. If you don't do that, getting into a preliminary spot in general surgery may be the next best thing to do. And then many people like Jens have found open spots in the middle of their training, the general surgery training, and they jumped into those opportunities. But for other people like myself, if you finish your general surgery training, then that's another opportunity. It's definitely a longer road to becoming a plastic surgeon, but given how competitive plastic surgery is definitely something to think about before you start the process. I think anyone who starts this process needs to understand the importance of sub-internship, needs to understand the importance of research, and also the networking, because what happens is at some point, some people, the plastic surgery community in the US is a small community. So at one point or the other, someone will have to vouch for you and say good things about you. And if there's an open spot, you can be the one, or if you're just applying for an independent spot, again, you can be the one. In terms of research, I think it's important to do research in larger academic institutions, again, because of the networking, the resources, you will most likely be able to distinguish yourself. Hurdles. The visa is my main issue right now. I did not have the opportunity to either get a green card beforehand while I was doing the research, or even get the H-1B visa, which is a good visa. I was with the J-1 visa. I'm still stuck with the J-1 visa, and I'm in the process of trying to get rid of that burden. I'm gonna stop here because we can have some Q&A and move forward.
Thank you, George. I think that kind of shows all the different experiences. Just on the visa thing, I just got my green card last week and been here for a good 10 years. So it's definitely been a long route. So there's a lot of different kind of factors to consider. We've had some questions here on the side. How did you apply for sub-Is? Did you apply through companies such as AMO, etc., or did you email hospitals directly? Before I pass this on to the group, I just want to say I missed this sub-I deadline, and also I didn't have access to, I think I had to have the USMLE Step 1 in order to do sub-Is in many places, and I didn't have that at the time. I did the Step 2 first before I did Step 1. So I wasn't eligible for sub-Is, but there were certain hospitals that accepted observers. So I came for 2 weeks and did an observership in Miami, and got a letter of recommendation through that, which was very fortunate. And so that's another kind of little loophole that you might be able to consider. So I'll pass it on to the panelists. How did you apply for the sub-Is you did?
So the sub-Is that I did, people are very open to international students doing sub-Is. There are places where you can rotate for free. There are places where you can pay for your rotation. So for example, I did not rotate at Harvard because it was frankly too expensive to rotate there. So I rotated at Mount Sinai, where you could just, rotate for free like any other American student, and I had a great experience. And you just contact the student affairs office at each of the hospitals and universities, and they're very responsive. I don't know if anyone else did a sub-I.
I did not.
It seems like we're the only one.
Yeah, and I'm happy to comment, at least from a program standpoint, if that's helpful.
Yeah, of course.
I think it is tricky for often some international medical graduates to do sub-Is in the context that medical schools will all have different limits. And I think Dr. Gafur was talking about kind of her experience. Some centers are more open to it than others. My institution is fairly closed about it. However, they do run a separate kind of global health program, and that allows students from other international medical schools to rotate and essentially do a sub-I. There are some I think some institutions probably have varying policies on what you're able to do from my experience, but I think that you guys the panelists may have some better suggestions on it. It is a little bit tricky, and there are some opportunities for little observerships. I don't know if others will talk about that. It gets even trickier if you've already graduated from medical school, because there's a little bit more leniency to allowing students to come and participate versus if you're in this kind of gray zone of you've already graduated, but you're not a resident. And so you don't have the potential for kind of malpractice coverage and some of the other stuff that's needed. So I don't know if the panelists have any experience with that, but at least at our institution, it's one of the challenges is you have to still be a student. You can't have graduated. And it really has to kind of come through some specific programs.
Yeah, I think that's what the panel was also echoing. I would also say I'm the program director for our residency and kind of sitting on the other side of the table, which is kind of, interesting. But, the reality is, and I think it's important to be honest with any applicants, both domestic or international, that it is highly competitive to get into plastic surgery. And so if you come from another country, that puts you definitely at a disadvantage, both potentially from a visa standpoint. You're obviously not going to be trained within the US system. And so I'm not saying it would never be possible, but I would say it's rather rare that someone comes for one sub-I, and even if you have the world's best, USMLE scores, the 260s and whatnot, and maybe have done some research in your home country, that still will put you in a lower category. And so it's really what George said, and the others as well. So it's either you do, you're doing a sub-I and then you're here for a year of research or 2 years of research, you get to know people, you become a known commodity, then, that your chances are going to be, realistic. But just applying from your home country after one sub-I, I don't think that's going to give you a very realistic chance of matching. I'm not saying it's not possible, but, I would definitely temper your expectations. I don't know, Jeff, if you agree with that from at your institute.
No, I mean, I completely agree. I think it's just it's an unknown for a lot of people, and I'm sure the panelists can talk about their interview experiences. And there's already some questions about, how do you explain all the different visa statuses? And I think for programs, it's one factor that they don't understand. They don't understand, the medical systems. I'm guessing, again, all the panelists can probably talk about how many times you got asked in an interview, well, can you explain to me exactly how medical school works in blank country that you're from? Because I just don't think people understand the other systems. And so instead of kind of necessarily always spending the time to learn, it's just sometimes easier with other applicants to gloss over unless there's other stuff that jumps out.
Let me start my video. So I actually have a question for the panelists. We've had people apply who have on their own sought out extraordinary ability visas. And I was curious if any of you had independently worked with attorneys or organizations to get extraordinary ability visas to kind of bypass the visa problem in residency.
Yeah, I got a green extraordinary, it's called EB2 green card before I started residency. I think that our institution, at least at Partners, they offered free advice. So I know that is something that is available at our institution. I don't know if this is a service that's available at other institutions, but it was a very nice thing because I was able to go there with my CV and they were able to give me realistic expectations of whether or not I would be able to get this visa, and whether I should spend the money to get this visa, because you have to pay for that yourself. And it did work out for me. And I have several friends for whom this has worked as well. So I can only share a positive experience. But I think it depends on which country you're from, because these visas, there's only a certain amount of these visas that are available for every country. So certain countries have a longer wait list than others. So I think it's important to really discuss your individual case with a lawyer.
I think, a chat about visas can be a whole separate 2-hour webinar. There's so much, and I'm pretty sure that each one of us have been researching these to try and find the best way to tackle this issue. Again, my experience was with the J1 visa. J1 lasts up to 7 years, but you can extend it 1 more year, so that makes it 8, plus 2 of research that I did before I had the J1 visa sponsored by my first residency. So in order to do my fellowship, I had to switch to another type of extraordinary ability visa, which is called an O1 visa. And the O1 visa is a non-immigrant visa that gives you the opportunity, once you're granted the visa, to stay for 3 years and then potentially renew the visa every year. The only problem is cost, and that never gets you to an immigration pathway. So you can stay in the US for many years on an O1 visa, as long as you are eligible to begin with. until you find another way to do that. It's just that it's risky, and the administration can change, the rules can change. That's something I would not really highly recommend for the long term. If someone thinks that they're interested in investing in a long-term research, maybe what Lisa did, and go through the national interest waiver, knowing though that they will be doing research for a few years before they even get involved with residency, is a good way to go. Otherwise, if there's an opportunity, seek for programs that sponsor an H-1B visa, because the H-1B visa can get you to a pathway for a green card.
Thank you. We have a few questions come in here. Nisra is asking, when getting letters, would you recommend US letters from non-plastic surgeons, home institution letters from plastic surgeons, or a mix? Any thoughts on letters in general? So, I think, again, getting letters, the best letters are from people that have worked with you, that know how you work clinically and or research, rather than just a letter from someone with a, either a big name or, is a plastic surgeon but has barely worked with you. Because at the end of the day, what we want to see from, when we review letters for applicants is whether or not you're going to be someone that's going to be working hard, reliable, that is going to fit well in with the team, that has a vision for their career, and what kind of resident are we going to get for 6 years into our program. And so I think just having someone that knows you, I think is the most important thing. But of course, if you're doing a sub-I, then you should get a letter from wherever you're doing a sub-I at. Any other comments to that?
I mean, I think the advice that I got was, then I think is true, but I would be curious about your thoughts, is, that a clinical letter from the United States is very valuable because or the program directors just know what that means, versus having a clinical letter from, your home country where it's, the educational system is unclear and no one really knows. So I think the advice I got was that probably a clinical letter from the US would be better. And then to have, maximum of one research letter, because research is important, but you're not really looking for the research qualities in a resident who will be doing clinical training. I don't know if you would agree with that, or if you have other.
I mean, you bring up a very good point, actually, because every country has different ways of writing letters of recommendation. And for me, being from Switzerland, I'm sure it's the same for people from Germany. Like, we just don't write in superlatives as much. So if you get a letter from a Swiss institution that says this is a very good resident, then that means that it's a good resident. Whereas if you get the same letter from a US surgeon, then that may not mean as much, right? It has to say that it's one of the best I've worked with in the past 10 years, you would be highest recommendation and so forth. And that was actually uncomfortable for me to tell my boss in Switzerland that he has to kind of write, because I know he was happy with me, but the way he wrote the letter would have never flown in the US.
At the end of the day, a stellar application is a constellation of things, among which is the letters of recommendation, but you get what you can get. So if you can't work with plastic surgeons in the US, you have to have someone that really wants to check you up and say that you're the best that they've worked with and stuff like that. So if it comes from a general surgeon during your preliminary year, or even from your country of origin, that's okay. But you definitely, once you come to the US, you definitely need to start working in understanding how you can network with the community of plastic surgery through research to begin with.
And we had another question. Thank you all for this webinar. Is it possible for an IMG to match an integrated residency program at a place where they did not do research at? And, the answer is, as George was alluding to before, yes, absolutely. There can be also openings. Never forget that, if you do like general surgery prelims, there can be openings as a 2 or 3. Also, if you do research in an institution, your mentors will know people at other institutions, and they may not have a spot, at their home institution, but they may refer you to someone. I don't know if there's anyone else that has something about that. Then next question, as a current prelim surgery intern, what is the best time to look for an integrated plastic spot? And how should I plan this ahead? Would a PGY2 position in plastics be feasible?
So you should probably constantly be looking for open available positions. There are some websites where you can constantly peruse. I think one is the ACAPS website, one is APDS, and they advertise sort of available plastics and sort of general surgery positions. Another good resource is your actual program coordinator. So program coordinators across the country all know each other, and so they may know if there is open positions in other institutions, as well as your program director and chair. Everyone knows each other. And so it's a good idea to try and see if you can get these people on your side to sort of help you as a prelim resident try and get a position somewhere to continue.
I mean, I second that. I mean, your reputation as a prelim is like your everything, and that can be anything from someone in the OR, an anesthesiologist, or your peers, or you never know who's the one who's gonna recommend you to a colleague. For example, we hired a PGY3 resident. Ali Reza is originally from Iran, is an IMG, and we expanded our program, so we had a third spot opening, and that was relatively short notice, and so I just texted all my old colleagues and was like, do you know of a good IMG? Do you know of someone that would be willing to, that is a prelim and that would be willing to switch? And that's how we found Ali Reza. So yes, but your reputation matters, because I will definitely not hire a prelim without talking to some of his peers or find someone that has worked with that person and can vouch for them.
Yeah, I would agree. Basically, as a prelim, you have to be outstanding and, on par or better than the categoricals in order to be able to get backing from your program to be able to find a spot somewhere else.
Next question. I am an old graduate from 2011 and my STEP score is 230 and 99. After med school, I emigrated to Germany and has been working there as an ENT. Do you think having practiced in Germany since for so long is to be considered a gap or an issue in order to get into a plastic surgery residency here? Any takers?
I've done residency interviews, both as a chief resident in general surgery and in plastic surgery. And so I kind of understand a little bit the mentality, and I know that the gap issues have been brought up in the past. Now, that being said, if someone is willing to take the extra step and extra time to distinguish themselves, regardless of how much time, regardless of what the gap is, if they're excellent applicants and they have people to back them up, they would still be considered for a spot. It's just that they need to understand that they get themselves into a very lengthy process, and as long as they're willing to go all the way through, there's a chance. Nothing is guaranteed, of course.
There's another question down the same lines. Would you say that just being older, has less possibility to match in PRS? And I think you just kind of alluded to that. I think it really depends a bit on the personal conversation you have with that person. I mean, it is a long road, and going back in time, and I did 2 years of general surgery in Switzerland and then started over as an intern, and that felt hard enough. And so I can't possibly imagine how it feels when you're in your mid-30s and you're kind of already worked as a physician and in practice, and then you have to go back and someone explains you how to remove a JP drain. So anyone else? All right, does research have to be plastic surgery related? Is it fine to do other research? Is it only the publications that matter, or are there other things to consider?
I think that it's a package. I think it's an advantage to do plastic surgery research, but it doesn't have to be plastic surgery research. I think the thing that helps the most is the networking that you get out of going to research conferences and meeting other plastic surgeons around the country. So if you can pick and choose, then I would recommend doing research with a plastic surgeon and going to as many conferences as you can.
Then there's a question I don't 100% understand. Any idea if ECFMG accreditation at one's home institution counts for anything? I mean, ECFMG, you get, you do your USMLEs and all that, and then you get your, certificate for that. It's not really related to your home institution per se, unless I'm misunderstanding something. Can you transfer your visa once you start? So for instance, if you were given a J1 visa, can you transfer it to an H1B later? George was talking about it. I was in the same pathway. So I had a J visa for my entire residency. And then afterwards, you're pretty much a little bit in a difficult situation, because you either have to go home for 3 years, in which case you can reapply for an H1B after 3 years. If you don't want to go home for 3 years, then there's a couple of pathways. One is, finding an underserved area or underserved population, and getting, there's a certain amount of visas per state that, are given for those applicants. And so I got, for example, one of those here in Portland because I do gender surgery, and the transgender population here is underserved, and I have to prove each month that I serve a certain percentage of Medicaid patients. And then, of course, you need to find a hospital that is willing to go through the process of hiring you, because it's a complicated process. And I've been working with my immigration lawyer for 3 years through the hospital. Not every hospital is willing to do that. Or you end up going to more rural kind of cities where they are in need of physicians and are therefore willing to go through that pathway. And that is true for Canadians as well, which I'm always a bit surprised about. Since they're board eligible for the American boards, but anyone else? Are there any hospitals that are more IMG friendly, and which ones are they? I think it depends on what you mean. For prelim general surgery, there's definitely certain programs that are focusing on IMGs, like at Hopkins. Most of the prelim class were international medical graduates. And, so there are some of those institutions. When it comes to plastic surgery, I don't necessarily think so, that there's like any hospitals particular. I mean, there's some places where people have done, maybe Lisa, you can talk about it, where people do a lot of research for many years and then get in, and maybe there's some form of kind of pathway there that I'm not sure of. Maybe you can talk about that.
No, I don't think that there is a real pathway. I think in general, there are some institutions that are more open. I have felt like that the big academic institutions are more open actually to IMGs. But it's a very individual situation thing, and I don't think that's true across the board, unfortunately.
I can talk about my own program here. So we have 2 IMGs total, and that's kind of just, again, organically grown. I don't think any institution is going to be kind of just focusing, on that. In my own algorithm that I put in when I look at all the applicants, the international medical graduates are getting a second look. But primarily, we do kind of look at the kind of US-based applicants, unless someone is already kind of a known entity. And I think most programs do that the same way. Any other questions? The question was a misspelling, not ECFMG, but ACGME. I don't know too much about it. International institutions being ACGME accredited, or whether or not that is, a benefit. Any one of you trained or heard of an ACGME accredited institution abroad?
I have not heard of that. I think A stands for American, so it must be only within the US.
This is an interesting question by Andrew. Besides having several publications as serving as a reviewer or editorial board member of plastic surgery journals such as PRS or ASJ seen as somewhat research activity, I am not sure if it would be beneficial for applicants to put this type of activity on the CV or not.
Put it on there. Yeah, I would put it on. I mean, I think it shows that you have academic interest and have served as a reviewer. So I would definitely put that on the application. How much weight will be given to that activity, I'm unsure.
Also, how do you become editorial board member for PRS or ASJ if you haven't done a lot of research?
Well, yeah, I don't know.
I agree. It's not going to hurt, but I don't think it's going to stand out there and make a big difference for the selection process.
I think you should put everything that you've done that's relevant on your application. Don't exclude anything. Everything that you've done, you should put on there to try and beef up your application as much as possible.
And everybody here has already mentioned that, but again, this is a package, as Lisa said. So you have to have great scores, and that's something you can work on early on. If you can do a sub-internship and start the networking, and then you'll do the research. We did a study a couple of years ago. We surveyed or at least as many as we could in terms of international medical graduates in residency programs. Our response rate was not great, but I think we were able to discern a couple of things through that study. Because let's not forget that U.S. applicants, plastic surgery is extremely competitive for U.S. applicants. They do research, they do a lot of work, they take extra time to be involved in other projects or whatever before they apply for plastic surgery. So it's extremely competitive, high unmatched rates for even U.S. graduates. So what we found was that whatever an American graduate has, you have to have more than that, and in every different section of this process. So your score should be better, your research should be at least equivalent, PhD of course helps and all that stuff. Either an amazing performance during your sub-internship, or that has to be substituted by a great year as a preliminary when people can vouch for your clinical acumen, your work ethic and all that stuff. So whoever is interested should be making a list of the boxes that have to be checked and work on each individual box and not just lose focus.
Yeah, I definitely agree with George that, just thinking that, oh, I have, 45 publications, but you forgot about all the other boxes, that's not going to necessarily get you a spot. All right, so if there are any other questions, any other comments from the panelists?
And I think there's a question, I think directed at Lisa, specifically just about the name of the service at her institution, and she consulted about the visa before residency. I think there was also a question if anyone had names about, I want to say there was something about someone to help with visa status, whether it was a lawyer who helped any of them.
So I'm sorry if I wasn't very clear about this, but so at my institution, there's an international service that helps with visas. Now, unfortunately, that's specific to the institution. So if you're working at that institution, you can consult with them. But unfortunately, it's not a service that is open to the public. But I believe that these services are available at other institutions. I don't know if any of the panelists have experience with that. So, and even in Europe, there are international services that can help with visa questions.
My experience, I went through the international office at Duke to get my first visa, my J1 research, and then my alien physician J1. And then same thing with Hopkins. And when I had to switch visas and I went to O1, this is a little bit more of a delicate process. And so the Memorial Sloan Kettering lawyer was the one who did the process for me. Otherwise, if the hospital was not offering that, I would have to go through a private lawyer.
At my institution, when I moved here and switched to my H-1B, my hospital just contracted with a private lawyer, and paid them, kind of outside of that. So it wasn't like an institutional. And what I gathered from this process, I mean, you can technically do all those visa things by yourself. It's just very kind of complicated. And also a lawyer can kind of help, to move you a little bit up in the bunk of applications they have. For example, now it was the green card moratorium just, recently, and, my green card still came through. And so I think there is something about having an immigration lawyer that kind of knows how to grease the wheels and get your application through. But I think for a green card and, some of the other visums, you're going to be looking at, $5,000 to $10,000 in terms of lawyer fees if you go with a private lawyer, probably at least. One last question. Do you think programs are reluctant to give visas because our visa may get denied and they'll be short a resident, or because it's extra paperwork and they're unsure how the process works? I can answer that. I have a fellow coming from Canada right now that's going to start with me in August. And it is quite a bit of paperwork, and time again, there can be some delays that suddenly, the person can only start a month later, or the visa hasn't come through. So there's definitely always the risk of that. And then you are short a resident. But more than that, really, it's the amount of paperwork. So the U.S. hospitals have what's called graduate medical education kind of office, which is staffed by, and usually also understaffed, and they deal with all the new residents that come in through the system. And there's a lot to be done every year, July 1st, when the new residents come. So unless an institution is big enough that they have an international office, such as Lisa was referring to, where there's a whole team kind of taking care of that. The same was true at Hopkins, but not every institution has that. And so then that falls on not only GME, it falls on the program coordinator. So for me as a program director, I have one program coordinator that has to do all this stuff for me. And, having one international person adds an additional stress on her life. So if I suddenly have like 2 or 3, that becomes very unmanageable very quickly. So there's just a human resource issue a little bit there, and I think that's why these bigger institutions are often a little bit more receptive to international graduates than institutions of mid-size.
Now, the J1 visa gets processed through the ECFMG, so the programs don't have to do anything about it. And that's why the vast majority of the programs sponsor the J1 visa, because it's easy in terms of the process.
I think there are a few more questions, Jens.
Yeah. Can mission trips abroad with American plastic surgery groups count as U.S. experience? The U.S. experience is not like some kind of checkbox or category, right? It's at the end of the day, it's a letter of someone from within the United States system that can vouch for you. And so, if you do a 1-week mission trip, maybe not, depends a little bit. But just having a letter from an American surgeon, I would say, definitely adds to your application. It's not like some magic category.
It depends on what's in the letter, because you don't want to get a generalized letter from a US sort of reference, because that will probably not be seen as very favorable. It will probably seem as if they don't know you very well. So I think it also depends on the letter itself.
Well, I mean, the reality around letters is that, right, if we have a sub-I that rotates with me for a month and I see that person 2 or 3 times that month doing 1 or 2 cases, I still have to write a letter for that person. And I will also do so. So I solicit feedback from the residents and from other faculty, but there's also limits to how much time you can put into that. So the reality is that most letters are written by someone that you had quite limited contact with, right? If you just go for a sub-I. And so if you work on a mission trip with someone for a whole week and you spend a whole week together and you do surgeries, I think that is as valuable to me as a reference if the person you did the mission trip with is somewhat known, or has connections within the US, or at least is ethical and good surgeon, then I think that counts. Then, due to COVID-19 pandemic, all the observership and sub-Is have been canceled. When do you think the applicants can expect sub-I observerships available again? Anyone wants to tackle that, but it's a little bit state by state. It's by institution. And so we really don't know. And then on top of that, with the cases surging again, everything can change within a week to 2 weeks. So I think it's fair to assume that that most observerships and sub-Is traveling from out of state or internationally are not going to happen the next 3 to 4 months for a majority of the institutions, but I can't speak for all.
Yeah, same.
Yeah. It is same everywhere. I mean, it's the new normal, but it's the same for every prospect applicant right now, whether US or IMG. So.
Thank you for all. I'm already graduate and cannot do a sub-I. Dr. Ferris said that observership is not really giving your mentors a precise idea about your clinical performance, which is true, but also having letters from your research mentors seems not to be satisfactory. So what other options do we have?
I mean, what I'm trying to say is that, what the best thing is that you can have, but that doesn't mean that all these other things are not options. And you'll notice very quickly that no matter if you're a US or an IMG applicant, everyone has strengths and weaknesses in their application. So research letters are great, okay? And Jens was saying he had a great experience with an observership. So all these things are very good options, and they're not bad options at all. But if you can do a sub-I and if you're in that position, it's a good idea.
I mean, I can tie this back. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm sorry. I just want to say, I think having only research letters would be a disadvantage because you have nobody who can vouch for your clinical expertise. So I think that would be a disadvantage, but only research letters. But otherwise, I think you have lots of options.
I mean, I think I can tie this back to what I said in the beginning about my own road coming here. I did 2 years of gen surgery, but then I wanted to be cardiac surgeon in Switzerland. I had that all lined up, but then I had good scores in my USMLE step 1 and 2, and I suddenly felt like, maybe I should move to the United States and do, general surgery, take the longer road. And I really wanted to do that, but I was completely naive because I had good scores and I did these 2 weeks of observership. I thought I'm going to just apply to, the cities I want to live in. I was, still young. I was, I'm going to go to Boston, New York, and, just apply there. And then I literally just kind of clicked that, on the application also for Hopkins because, I felt that would be worth a shot. And then of course I got like one categorical interview in a small hospital in New York. And then, I only applied for categoricals. I didn't even know what prelim was. I had much less experience than all of you. And then, but then the only real interview I got was from Hopkins for prelim. And so, I went there and did that. But it's because I kept an open mind because I was like, what, I'm going to go into this. I'm going to take this opportunity. The reason they picked me is because they screened for, scores and, and some other things and, the letters I had from Switzerland. And they were like, we'll take you for a year. Let's just see how you do. And, that's why I did that. And I took the leap of faith and then, things kind of work out. So you kind of have to take a little bit of a leap of faith if you don't have like what Lisa has, like kind of full-on PhD and all that, you know, that other effort. And if you have an application that may not hit all these marks, then I'll apply broadly and see what happens and take a risk.
I'm sorry,
Alright.
I said I agree. I think if you have already graduated, you can have a sub-internship. I think having a preliminary in general surgery is the way to go, because if, let's just say you've done research in plastic surgery, you have some research mentors, and then you have some people that can, again, put on a piece of paper that, you know, your clinical judgment, your knowledge, your team, your work ethic and all that stuff are exemplary. So that's a good start. If you see there's 4 of us panelists here, one has gone into an integrated program through research. The other 3 of us went through the general surgery route. And I think just because of how competitive the residency is, whoever is now starting the process needs to have an open mind, as Jens said, and can start with research. If there's a plan for a PhD, definitely go for it. But nobody will guarantee you that at the end of 5 years of research, you'll get a spot. Who knows what the pool of applicants will be at that year. So you may just find yourself stuck in the lab forever. Start with research. If in the meantime, a program that has a reputation of placing residents in spots, whether categorical general surgery or PGY2 prelim and then something else, maybe is the way to go. And then people drop out of plastic surgery programs, or programs expand, and there may be an opportunity. And here you are now cashing out your hard work in general surgery with your very well organized networking and research in plastic surgery, and potentially you can be the perfect candidate for that spot.
All right, we'll take the last couple of questions and then we'll adjourn in the interest of everyone's time. How to appropriately request someone to make a phone call for you? You know, I would say that is usually you'd pick one, like, you don't want to be like, oh, can you call all the programs in the United States? I would say if you identify a specific program that you're really interested in, then, you know, you can approach that person if they know you well enough. And usually that would mean that that person's already a mentor. You wouldn't want to just ask someone that you kind of know to make a phone call. And then it's also more once the rank list is made. I think that's the time for actual phone calls. Before that would maybe be more an email. And keeping in mind that a lot of program directors get a ton of emails before the actual interviews go out. And that's not always going to be beneficial unless that person really knows you. And then the last question there, sorry guys, what do you mean by categorical versus prelim? So see, there's someone that was like me. Categorical means that you are hired for the entire duration of residency. So in general surgery, 5 years, plastic surgery, 6 years. You start 1st of July and 6 years later you graduate. And prelim means that you're hired for 1 year. There's no path to, you know, guaranteed path. Usually you don't stay at that program. You stay for 1 to 2 years. But they can terminate you after 1 year or after 2 years. And then either you find a categorical spot, which means you have to either repeat a year, or if you're lucky, you find a spot, you know, like I told you earlier, like you go from a PGY2 prelim to a categorical 3rd year spot. Or you can go back to the lab and then try again. All right, well, I want to thank all of you. For taking time out of your evenings. I'm sure there's some of you that are in the middle of the night somewhere on planet Earth joining in. So thanks for coming. And, you know, ACAPS will continue to have resources up on our website. So just check out for those. There's going to be useful information. And otherwise, I'm sure every one of you can also reach out directly to ACAPS and they can forward us questions. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Bye.